technical difficulties, so our guests, we're working on getting them into the Zoom. So please hold tight and we'll be with you shortly.
Mic check. Nothing.
stabilizing and getting through our last technical difficulties that we're having here. I'm going to blame two-step, three-step authentication across various devices as part of the problem for the delay, and all of us struggling to remember our passwords in a new environment. Also, the Tanger here at the auditorium that we're in has been busy today with an event ahead of us. I hope you can all hear me fine on the live stream, and everybody who is here in the Tanger, thanks so much for your patience, and especially thank you to Erin Reed and Professor Beely Harrison Altman. Are they hearing me? Are they not hearing me? Okay, we're getting close.
Special thanks to tech.
One last tech request here. Plus the email speed is lightning fast, just kidding. So we are sending out the Zoom link to our presenters today, the moderator and the presenter. So please bear with us as the internet on campus, maybe because of the snow, is also extremely slow. We're about to open the Zoom meeting. All right, so now because we are definitely several minutes late, thank you so much again for your patience. You can start the projection as well, I believe. Everything has been going wrong today. Yay, Erin! Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, how's it going? It's okay, it happens this way. Technical difficulties, we're good though. I'm here.
Thank you so much. And is B in the room as well? Sammy, did B make it in? Okay, we're waiting for the moderator to join as well. There, I hear a noise.
There we go.
Like this. Now, so we can see everybody. Hi, B. Thank you so much for joining, and so sorry for the technical difficulties.
It's totally fine. No, I'm used to those. Very used to those.
Well, I got a little nervous because across all these platforms, I had, of course, checked my passwords and everything this morning before I headed over here, but somehow it just didn't want to work on this podium here. But thank you to the president of the LGBT Alliance, Rose Rowe, who's in the audience here today, jumping on and knew their passwords and got a new Zoom link to you all. So I really appreciate Rose for doing that. I don't want to take very much time because there isn't that much anymore, but I have to say just a few things, and really to thank our co-sponsors, the Women's Center and also Women in Gender Studies. There are simultaneous events on campus right now that you may know about in the library that they're already doing. So please go check out the Black Women's Book Swap that's also happening. There's a reception for that in the library today. I also want to mention the Hess Scholar, the Wolf Institute is hosting many events during the month of March, and Barbara Smith, an amazing Black activist, lesbian, feminist, is the Hess Scholar this year. So if you don't know about those events, please check those out. And the best place to do that is probably just to Google Brooklyn College Hess Scholar or Brooklyn College Wolf Center, and you can find out all that information there. I want to celebrate the fact that this is the last day of Black History Month, and we celebrate Black history all year long. Woohoo! And tomorrow marks the beginning of the Women's History Month, and as I already mentioned, plenty of events going on. Sammy's going to come up just for 2 seconds. Sammy also works in the center, and tell you just a little bit about Lavender graduation.
Hey everyone, so if you don't know what Lavender graduation is, it is a ceremony that a lot of universities and colleges put on to specifically celebrate their LGBTQ+ graduates. If you or any of your friends are graduating, whether it's undergrad or graduate, we really hope that you'll join us in our ceremony so we can celebrate your achievements. We have these little forms that have a code you can scan to access the form to fill out. You can find these papers next to the sign-in sheet over there, and we also, for the people joining us online, we posted it on our social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Discord, and also through our newsletter.
Thanks so much, Sammy. I'm going to start by just quickly introducing Bea, who has joined us. Bea Lee Harrison Altman, they, them, is a political theorist, educator, and trans activist. They received their doctorate from the Graduate Center CUNY, but has been teaching at CUNY since 2008. Their research is situated where the borders of trans studies, critical theory, and Black feminist thought converge. Bea lives in Springfield, Massachusetts, thus the presence via Zoom today, instead of driving through knee-deep snow to get here, as they were still willing to do, which I really appreciate. And identifies as non-binary trans feminine. And so with that, I'm really just gonna turn it over to you to introduce Erin. We're so incredibly excited. And also at the end of Erin's presentation today, Bea's gonna hang out and help us have a conversation and have a Q&A. The YouTube live stream is live, and so we will be able to put in the chat and feed you questions, Bea, later on from the YouTube live stream. So everybody who's on the YouTube, feel free to share questions as well. And with that, I'll just hand it over to you two.
Right. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Erin Reed. And I apologize for my voice going in and out. As soon as it snows, it's all over. Like, voice is almost gone. But Erin Reed is a queer and trans legislative researcher, content creator, and activist. Based in Washington, D.C., Erin tracks LGBTQ+ legislation around the U.S. and appears as content for her newsletter via Substack, Erin in the Morning, of which I am a subscriber. Work has appeared in other social media venues such as TikTok and Twitter, which averages viewers in the hundreds of millions. Erin has been the subject of news coverage and interviews for the AAP, Washington Post, USA Today, Vice, The Hill, and many other political news outlets. Among the most powerful creative works is the world's only informed consent hormone therapy map, one of the largest known resources for trans communities and healthcare equity, enabling users to locate HRT clinics. As of this writing, over 4 million users, I believe, which is amazing. Erin can be reached by Twitter and TikTok at Erin in Lorne, and all of this information is already available. And without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Erin.
Totally. Thank you so much for the introduction. First, I'm going to try to share my screen, and then I'm going to introduce myself. So let's see how this works. Host is disabled screen sharing, which I imagined would happen. So
Fix that.
yes.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to share my screen. And first of all, let me just explain who I am. You did a great job at sort of like introducing me here. I do track anti-trans, anti-queer, anti-LGBTQ legislation moving all over the United States. I try to make it digestible for people. I talk about it in short little clips on TikTok. I write about it on Twitter, and then I write about it in my newsletter. My goal with this presentation, with my work, with all of this is to just kind of give everybody an idea of what's going on in the United States and in the world around queer and trans people. You know, make sense of why you see more queer and trans people and why these people tend to be more targeted lately by legislation, because I truly believe that knowledge is power, and that by informing ourselves on the entire slate of how queer and trans people are being handled in society right now, we are better able to advocate for our rights. And so today I'm going to be presenting on what I and others have called the rainbow scare. You've probably heard of similar scares, the lavender scare, the red scare. We are currently in a time period where queer and trans people are targeted and demonized both by legislators as well as far-right groups, specifically for our gender identity and queerness. And so I will go into sort of the background, what has led to this and what's going on right now. So we're going to talk about like how we got here. We're going to talk about the scare itself. We're going to talk about the worst laws that are currently being proposed. We're going to talk about how we can be effective advocates around these issues. So first, how we got here. I'm going to give you a broad overview of all of the things that happened legally and politically before now. So we can go all the way back, like queer and trans rights. We can go back to 2003 with Lawrence versus Texas. Very famous case. This happened whenever a police officer arrested two gay men for gay sex, essentially. And this led to Lawrence versus Texas, the right to privacy, the right to be able to show your love the way that you feel as your sexual orientation or gender identity. This then led to several other cases. We saw Smith versus Salem, which was the first trans rights case where Title VII applied. In 2009, the Affordable Care Act passed, which many of you are aware of. Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act says that you cannot discriminate in healthcare on sex, and this would become a big deal later on as well as right now. And then in 2007 to 2009, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act was passed. It excluded trans people originally. This was a huge fight. I know that the trans community was specifically upset with the Human Rights Campaign for excluding trans people in the bill. Eventually, we were worked back into it. The big case. Everybody knows about this one. It's Obergefell versus Hodges. And this was the right to marry. This was gay people's right to marry. And this was what so many queer, trans, LGBTQ people were fighting for a very long time. Lighthouse got lit up in beautiful rainbow colors. And I mark this as the beginning of the reactionary movement against LGBTQ people. This was a victory by far. It's one of our biggest victories ever. But this was a major loss among conservative people. And so they needed to regroup and find a new way of targeting people. And that's what we're going to talk about. Second. So in 2016, we had the North Carolina bathroom ban. This was the year after Obergefell versus Hodges. It's actually late 2015, kind of got enacted in 2016. And this was the first anti-trans law in a long time. It banned trans people from bathrooms that matched their gender identities. So, for instance, I'd be forced to male bathroom. Trans men would be forced into female bathrooms. It caused a strong reaction. NBA All-Star Game was canceled. States started issuing travel bans to North Carolina. There were concerts and public events that were canceled. They lost hundreds of millions of dollars off of this ban. And there was a huge push against it. And so the ban eventually fell. This ban and the way that this was handled actually meant that no anti-trans bills would be passed for several more years after that, because it was such a sustained reaction against this bill. We also had the Equality Act that was attempted. And obviously this has never happened. This would add gender identity and sexuality to a list of non-discrimination protections in the Civil Rights Act. And this has not happened. This is something that a lot of LGBTQ people want on a national level. It would solve a lot of the issues that we face in terms of legalized discrimination, but we have not had that yet. 2018 was the first, I think, modern anti-trans and anti-queer legislation. It was the Trump 2018 memos, and these did a number of things. These stripped gender from all sex-based protections in the US Code. It banned trans people from the military, which is like the big thing that everybody remembers, but it also did a lot of other things. So like, for instance, it prevented trans people from seeking asylum across the border if they were going to get extradited back to non-friendly countries that could execute them for being trans. That didn't matter. And there were a number of people that got sent back to their home countries that were transgender that did lose their lives. 2018 to 2019, we saw the first bills targeting the community. So we saw some attempts to reintroduce that bathroom ban that I mentioned earlier. We saw some states that were hesitant to enact anti-trans and anti-queer legislation because of what happened in North Carolina. And the first state that actually passed something since 2016 was Tennessee. It was kind of a bathroom ban, but then it watered it down, and eventually they just didn't enact it at all. And now we get to the modern times. So I'm going to just talk about all of the crazy and wild things that are going on in 2019 to today around transgender visibility, queer visibility, acceptance, etc. So number one, queer people and trans people people are increasingly identifying as transgender. So for instance, you see right here, baby boomers, Gen Z, millennials, and Gen X all saw increases in transgender identification and LGBTQ identification at large, by the way. So this isn't just trans, this is lesbian, gay, and bisexual. This likely happened because of an increase in social acceptance. There was more social acceptance in the last 5 years, and this is sort of the history of minority, LGBTQ people broadly. As time has gone on through the 90s, the 2000s, 2010s, we have been increasingly able to see visibility, to feel free to be ourselves in public. There's a really good example about this. So, a lot of times this trend right here is seen as evidence of like social contagion, and that trans people are only identifying as trans because of, it's trendy or something like that. The truth is that this isn't the first time that we've seen this. Back in the early 1900s, left-handedness, only 2.5% of people identified as left-handed. And then in around 1940, 1960, it was closer to 12%, which has evened out since then. We are still 12% left-handed as a society. And that isn't because there was a sudden trendiness to being left-handed. That's not why it occurred. In reality, what happened was that mass manufacturing in the 1900s actually made it so that left-handed tools could be created. Left-handed people were more easily able to be accommodated in society, and therefore people felt more free to be and to express themselves with their left hand, and people that were naturally left-handed could be that instead of forcing themselves to use their right hand. In many ways, sometimes being trans and being in the closet can feel similarly, like you're being forced as a left-handed person to use your right hand. It's rather awkward, and it can cause problems. Meanwhile, transgender celebrities emerged, so we started getting more visibility in the general public. We got Michaela J. Rodriguez from Pose, won Best Actress, first trans woman to win Best Actress at the Golden Globes. Elliot Page from the Umbrella Academy. Nikki Tutorials from YouTube, mega influencer around makeup. She actually did not disclose her trans identity until about 1.5 years ago, and just came out as trans, and everybody realized that, oh, she's been trans all along. These big moments, I think, were big parts of like how society, media-wise, has advanced. Hunter Schafer, everybody might know HBO's Euphoria, great show. We saw Amy Schneider, who is one of the foremost Jeopardy champions in history, have this amazing run, win like $1.5 million total, and obviously Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black. So we see all of these trans celebrities that were being portrayed in a way that was not harmful anymore. Because up to this point, trans people in media were just punchlines, or targets of violence, or perpetrators of violence. And so we start to see sort of a change in the way that trans people are presented. Meanwhile, informed consent clinics become a thing. So in 2010, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health stated that you should not need to pay a therapist for 2 years, thousands and thousands of dollars, just to access hormone therapy if you're trans. And so they opened up the avenue to create something called an informed consent clinic, which is where if you are trans, you go through a mental health assessment, a small mental health assessment, usually at the clinic. And then at the clinic, they will then prescribe you hormone therapy, and they'll monitor your levels, and they will help guide your transition in a medically safe way. And so I, 3 years ago, mapped out all these clinics. And this is kind of how my very first foray into LGBTQ activism, at least modern trans activism. I mapped out a bunch of clinics, and this map, it's the Informed Consent map. You can Google it, Erin's Informed Consent HRT map. Been used, I think, now around over 4 million times. I get messages from trans people literally every day about how they use this map to access their transition care. So transition is now easier. So we see media representation, we see increasing visibility and ability to come out because trans people are more respected, and now we see medical transition is easier to access now. Now, on the other side of things, we start to see backlash. We see 2 major books come out, Abigail Schreier and Helen Joyce's books, Irreversible Damage and Trans When Ideology Meets Reality. I want to just talk a little bit about these books because they are cited in court cases, they're cited in legislative fights. Conservative columnists read these books. These were 2 of the first books that kind of targeted trans community. Irreversible Damage has the provocative image of a little girl with a hole where her uterus is, and really this is reaching towards anti-abortion arguments, and the book itself contains several anti-abortion arguments as well, all about how transgenderism is depriving the reproductive capacity of our children. And if you read Helen Joyce's Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, it becomes increasingly clear that this is of our white children. So this does intersect with race, this intersects with anti-Semitism. There are arguments in these books that have been used by people on the far right to make those similar arguments as well. Then at the same time, so this is all going on at the same time, we have the Luna Younger case. It's a big case in Texas, 7-year-old trans girl. There's a father who wanted to detransition her to say, no, you can't present as a girl. Her mother said that it was okay if you presented as a girl, and they went to court in Texas, not a very liberal state. In Texas, all custody fights are handled via jury. It's one of the strange things about Texas. A lot of people thought that Luna's mom would not win this case just because of the fact that it's a conservative court. However, Luna's mom was a very compelling speaker, talked about Luna's history as a trans girl. They brought in therapists, they brought in experts, and Luna's mother won the case. With some limitations. Her father won the right to consent to hormone therapy whenever Luna was older. However, this entire time, the reason why I mentioned this case, this blew up. This got all over right-wing talk radio, it got on the Fox News. Luna Younger's case kind of took the United States right-wing by storm. And this was the beginning of we have to stop trans kids. We've got to medically detransition trans kids shouldn't exist, etc. This is where it all stems back to. Meanwhile, we've got J.K. Rowling. I'd be remiss if I don't talk about J.K. Rowling in a sort of cultural landscape of what's going on around transgender rights. In 2018, she started liking tweets from accounts that were explicitly anti-trans, tweets from accounts that sell pins that say, sorry about blah, 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 you can see it right here, F your pronouns. She starts promoting people that basically advocate against trans people using bathrooms, trans people getting identity documents that match their gender identity. These are all people that she starts promoting on her account. People pointed it out, and she kind of stayed quiet about it, and she wrote this essay called Turf Wars. TERF, by the way, stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. So it's essentially saying that feminism, but we excluded trans people from that feminism. It's a little bit more complex than that, but her full-throated support of anti-trans legislation ended up being used in many court fights. She's been cited in court fights. It was used in legislatures to support anti-trans bills, and she has been very active in the United Kingdom and likewise opposing anti-trans measures there that allow trans people to, for instance, update your identity documents or access medication. Jesse Singal in the United States, meanwhile, this I think would be the first both sides article on transgender people. This will become a theme. And in fact, I don't know how many of you pay attention to the news around like the New York Times, but there was, for instance, a big blow up around the New York Times. All of the LGBT orgs criticized the New York Times for inaccurate coverage of trans people. Essentially, it's sort of like this sort of both sides have problems reporting that eventually settles on we should just stop trans kids from having medical treatment at all, and that transgenderism is a trend, and that trans people don't know themselves. And so this particular article was the first to focus on transgender trendiness, like that left-handed chart that I showed you earlier. It recruited parents from a website called Transgender Trend, which explicitly were parents that are anti-trans, explicitly so. They don't believe that trans people should exist at all. And it used a trans boy's picture without consent, in a way without consent, and misgenders him. You can read right here, your child says she's trans, she wants hormones and surgery, she's 13. Very provocative image, and of course they misgendered him. I would like to point out, by the way, this was in 2018. I want you to read this little tiny section up here. We're not prepared for the next pandemic. Note that trans people get this full page treatment, and there's this little tiny headline up at the top, we're not prepared for the next pandemic. This just goes to show that, like, we've had outsized and overemphasized attacks in the media. So these are the arguments consolidated. This is where all of the arguments sort of settle down onto, and I'll just sort of go through them and let you know the general response to them. You can explore these later. First is that HRT and puberty blockers cause irreversible damage. You remember the book Irreversible Damage earlier? Puberty blockers actually are reversible, and they're used to buy time for later transitioning teenagers. Another one is that these drugs are experimental. Blockers have actually been used for 50 years in kids of precocious puberty, and this fact was integral to overturning the Alabama gender-affirming care ban, or at least pausing that ban. Another argument was that 85% of trans teenagers will desist. They will stop being trans. This is actually based on 1990s criteria, where trans teens could not be trans. As a trans teen that grew up in the 90s myself, I could not be trans in the 1990s. It was impossible. It was hard for me to do, and so I had to stay in the closet. I would have been considered under this stat a desister. Another, obviously, transgender people are a trend. We've talked about that earlier with left-handedness. And transition is linked with high suicide rates. Actually, no, not having gender-affirming care, but being trans is linked to high suicide rates. Gender-affirming care, like blockers and hormone therapy, reduced suicidality by 73%. So, we're at 2020 now. We're getting close to where we are now. The types of anti-trans and anti-queer legislation that starts to pop up. We see sports bans, gotta ban trans people in sports. We see healthcare bans, gotta ban trans people from medication. Child abuse provisions, which I will talk about later. Religious objection laws, name change and gender marker bans, so removal of your ability to change your name on your driver's license, or your birth sex on your driver's license. Bathroom bans, we start to see these pop up in schools. We see don't say gay bills, like in Florida. Drag bans and amendments that define gender and sex. We'll go over some of these. So in 2020, we had the first healthcare and sports bans. You see this right here. Idaho governor signs into law anti-transgender legislation. This was the first sports ban of any state. And I want to say something real quick right now. I have been following the organizations that write these bills, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the American Principles Project. They are quoted as saying that the reason why they brought sports bans in 2020 is because they knew that it would be easier to ease the American public into full-out bans on being trans by starting with something small like sports. And there are quotes around this. They do advocate for ending gender-affirming care entirely for adults. We'll talk about that later. Idaho bans birth certificates. Both of these bills are enjoined in court. Meanwhile, we get the biggest trans rights ruling in the Supreme Court ever. This, for trans people, Bostock versus Clayton County for trans people, is like Obergefell for LGBT people. This essentially states that discrimination on gender identity is necessarily discrimination on the basis of sex. That was a quote from Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion. A conservative wrote the opinion. This bill was decided 6-3, and this statement right here has been used to overturn or block so many anti-trans laws. Mind you, We are down one liberal and up one conservative in the court. This decision would likely be 5-4 in the current court. There is a little bit of nervousness around what happens if gender-affirming caravans make it to the Supreme Court. Will they hold to this precedent that they created themselves, or will they create new precedent? I think a lot of people are nervous about that, especially in lieu of the Dobbs decision around reproductive health care and around abortion. 2021, we get the first massive onslaught of bills. We have 100 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced by Alliance Defending Freedom, Focus on the Family, Heritage Foundation. A lot of them pass. We get some sports bans again, a healthcare ban, and some birth certificate bans. 2021, Tavistock versus Bell, the UK. The big gender clinic in the United Kingdom, they ruled that that this gender clinic can no longer provide gender-affirming care for trans youth. That ruling was overturned in the UK Supreme Court a few months later. However, that ruling is still cited in the United States in several bills as if it's still in effect, which it is not still in effect. And then we start to see increasingly eliminationist rhetoric that essentially targets the trans community with actions that would curtail our right to exist in public. So people like Matt Walsh, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, Michael Knowles, all of them have very recently, in fact, as early as today, stated things like we must end transgenderism entirely, or we must, or transgender people do not have a right to exist, and they are not a real class of people. Like, we've heard these specific words spoken by these people. Meanwhile, we get to now. The 2022 to 2023 Rainbow Scare. More anti-queer bills and anti-trans bills than any other time in history. We have 500 in the last 2 years. 7 healthcare bans, with many more on the way right now. 18 sports bans, 10 don't say gay bills that go much further than the Florida one. 1 drag ban that also targets trans people in Tennessee. We got right to bully bills, so like bills that explicitly tell students that they've got a right to use a trans person's old name and pronouns. Right to refuse care to abortion patients or LGBTQ patients. So if you show up to the hospital, you need an emergency abortion, it's a right to refuse care, no matter if it hurts you or not. If you're an LGBTQ person, if you're a trans person who is found on the side of the road by an ambulance and they see that you're trans, they can refuse care to you, according to bills like those. This has actually been done in Dallas. You can look up the Tyra Hunter case in Dallas and you can learn about that. Black trans woman in Dallas who had a car accident. The medics went to, perform medical care on her, discovered her anatomy, and withdrew. She died. A return of bathroom bans, bans defining gender and sex that apply to all people, pronoun bans. We've seen ridiculous bills. Okay, so like here's an example bill right here. A North Dakota bill that would require employers to use pronouns associated with your deoxyribonucleic acid. And it actually says like associated with deoxyribonucleic acid because they're that pretentious. And so like, our pronouns are not encoded in our DNA. There's nothing biological about pronouns. Pronouns are language. Language is different in every language. These are real headlines here. The first 3 are going to be mine from my newsletter. The second 3 are going to be from major news organizations. These represent sort of what we're seeing right now. We see, for instance, a Kentucky bill that bans social transition. We see a Florida bill that makes accusing somebody of transphobia defamation with a $35,000 fine. We've seen South Dakota with a bill that literally tells doctors how to detransition forcibly their trans teens. It says specifically, systematically reduce their hormones over the course of a year in the bill. These are not my headlines. These are from major outlets. So we see, for instance, Tennessee's drag bill, which basically stops people from going out and dressed in the gender that they were not assigned at birth in many ways. And this headline here says, can Tennessee's drag bill repel Broadway shows? Because several Broadway shows have people dressed in drag. We see a recent video from Donald Trump that says he promises to erase the transgender community at any age. We see on CBS News that a Texas bill would ban gender-affirming care not just for trans youth, but for adults, for everybody. And so we're seeing this. This is like what we're seeing progress. So now we're going to talk about the worst ones, the ones that I have seen that are either in effect or about to be in effect. And this just shows like the length that transgender people tend to be targeted right now. So in 2021, Tennessee declared that all bathrooms had to post this sign right here: if you let trans people in your bathroom. Notice this facility maintains a policy of allowing the use of restrooms by either biological sex, regardless of the designation of the restroom. And if you thought you would be very cheeky and like write a bunch of arrows saying, but we still respect trans people, the law also said that you couldn't have anything around the sign for like X number of feet. And so like they really wanted to make sure that the sign was all that you posted. That bill was actually enjoined in court. This bill was overturned, so thankfully this is no longer in effect. This is that South Dakota bill I talked to you about earlier. Right here, you can see down here, if a professional has initiated a course of treatment for a minor, it is in that minor's medical records, immediately terminating the minor's use of a drug would cause harm. The healthcare professional may institute a period during which the minor's use of the drug or hormone is systematically reduced. So this is telling doctors essentially how to practice medicine and saying that you must detransition your trans patients that are in your care. In Texas, last year, Governor Greg Abbott started investigating the parents of transgender kids for child abuse, basically stating that if you had a trans teen, you could be charged with child abuse. I helped several families escape Texas whenever this was going on. We raised lots of money for them. Some of the families that escaped Texas are worried about getting called back into Texas just for having a trans kid. There was one case of a family that I spoke to who has a trans son. Her son is 19 now and is living in Colorado, fully transitioned, very happy, very successful. She came under criminal investigation for child abuse because this law is retroactive. It goes back. And so, like, her kid is trans and existing in public, and they were still going to try to charge her with child abuse. This is currently blocked in court in Texas, by the way. Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, you all know the Don't Say Gay bill or Don't Say Trans bill. Basically bans classroom instruction on gender identity and sexuality, but this also is targeted towards trans people because a teacher saying their pronouns might be considered instruction. Just today, we got news that they were expanding this bill. And this just happened just before I came on here today. The new expansion raises the age to 8th grade, and it also bans any teacher from using pronouns not associated with a student's biological sex. No matter if the parents are okay with it. This basically says that all teachers in Florida would have to misgender their students. It's a new bill. I might report on it today in my newsletter. Not sure yet, but it's bad. You know, like we're seeing this expansion. We got the Oklahoma bathroom ban enforced outing. It tells teachers that they have to out all of their transgender students to their parents. If they even see gender nonconformity, they have to out those students to their parents. It bans trans students from restrooms that match their gender identity. It pulls them off hormone therapy. We saw Florida convene a medical board that pulls trans youth off hormone therapy. They also released a memo saying that social transition should be banned. Social transition is just literally a new name, you know, different clothing. Arkansas, we saw Arkansas pass a bill that would withdraw trans people hormones. This is currently blocked in court in the Brandt versus Rutledge case. Jon Stewart and John Oliver both had a recent special on this particular case. Tennessee's drag ban. This is a bad one, y'all. This one is just, I don't know if you've watched the news, but this just happened last week. This bans male and female impersonators, quote unquote, in public spaces. And I will note that in the hearing, most, if not all, of the proponents of this bill conflated transgender people with drag and said that transgender people are male and female impersonators. It bans this from public. It could perhaps ban trans people from performing in public. Definitely bans drag from public. If drag is prurient, is the standard, then they can be arrested and charged with a felony. And this word prurient essentially means incites lustful thoughts. And so essentially any police officer that sees a trans person or somebody in drag can say, I think they're inciting lustful thoughts, I'm gonna arrest them. You know, and don't for a moment think that this is only gonna end up being targeted at the trans community and at drag people. Like, this is an expansion into what it means to be your gender and what norms are enforced by the state around how you dress and how you present yourself. This is an encroachment. And this is a return to essentially pre-Stonewall era. This is what led to Stonewall. Things like this are what led to Stonewall. Anti-drag laws were part of what happened. one of the reasons why people were arrested in Stonewall, which was where the first pride occurred, was because anti-drag laws were being enforced on the patrons of Stonewall. That led to the patrons of Stonewall rioting, and that's how we got our first pride. And so, of course, laws like this can be weaponized against pride. Because if you're trans or in drag and dancing down the street, somebody might think that you're prurient. So I'm going to show a few maps now, because maps are always fun. These maps kind of show a general idea of what the state of the United States is right now on trans rights. If you see your state in orange, that state is currently banned from having trans people participate in sports. Here's a map of don't say gay bills and don't say trans bills and laws. Dark orange means that it censors all discussion of LGBTQ people in schools. Light orange means that they have to notify parents before they talk about LGBTQ people. Beige, it leaves it up to the school district. And so even in very liberal states, New York, there are school districts that have their own little don't say gay policies at their schools. And then if you are in green, it mandates all school districts teach about LGBTQ identities. And so you can see there's not very many states that mandate LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. There are some. Here's a map of bans on gender affirming care. So what this is the most recent map. I made this map. If you see your state in dark red, so that's Utah, South Dakota, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida, gender affirming care for trans youth is illegal there right now. You cannot obtain it in these states. A lot of these just happened, and youth in these states are currently working on fleeing the states or finding alternative ways to obtain their medication. If you see your state in a lighter red, so that's all of these other states, they currently have bills that are moving that have chances of passing. There is a chance that every single one of these light red states could see a bill pass that bans gender affirming care for trans youth, and in some cases trans adults. Missouri, for instance, would ban it for people in prison. Texas would do the same. South Carolina has one that goes up to 21 years old, as does Kansas. And so, we are seeing an expansion into transgender adults as well with these bills. Here is a map of gay and transgenic laws. So did you know that if you live in a state on this map that is in beige, if you kill a transgender person or a gay person because you did not know that they were trans or because they came onto you, you can claim sudden and temporary insanity. And this defense has been successfully used multiple times in the United States. I slept with a trans woman, I discovered her anatomy, I killed her. And they've let people off for this many times. If your state is in beige, that's legal. Let me also remind you that many of these cases where trans women are killed for this, this is used as an after-the-fact justification. They could kill a trans woman for any number of reasons, but they can say that I discovered their anatomy and that caused me temporary insanity. We've seen this numerous times. And so, you can see even some very, sort of traditionally progressive states do not have a ban on this defense. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, several states don't have any sort of ban on this defense. Montana, Representative Zoe Zephyr, who is also my partner, she tried to introduce a bill there, and it got voted down. So, legislators are explicitly saying that this is okay. Here's a map of birth certificate laws. If your state is in dark green, you've got really good laws around changing a birth certificate. It's usually relatively easy. The lighter greens have restrictions like surgery restrictions or have to publish in a newspaper, all those kinds of things. And dark orange means that you can't change your birth certificate. Tennessee is the only state that you currently can't change your birth certificate because all of the other states have court fights that have enjoined them and made them allow birth certificate changes. But several states are trying to pass laws that stop that from happening. So like Missouri, for instance, right now is pushing a birth certificate ban. This is a legislative risk map. This is my map. I create this every few weeks. This shows which states are at the highest risk of seeing further anti-trans legislation in the next 2 years. So if your state is in dark red, they've already got some of the worst laws. If you see your state in orange, it means that they're moving that way. They have several bills that are working their way through the legislature. Little exclamation points means that they are likely about to head to the next category. Light blue are states that, they don't have anti-trans laws that are progressing, but they don't have a lot of protective laws either. The little plus ones are the ones where states are considering very protective laws. And then dark blue means that these states have very good protections for LGBTQ people and trans people in particular. So California, for instance, has a bill, has a law that allows you to flee one of these criminalizing states, and many people are fleeing these states for their medication. And if you get to California, if you get to the borders of California, they're not going to extradite you back to your home state. So, we talked about Texas earlier, that mother that's being investigated for her trans kid, who's 18, 19 years old. If she moves to California, California will say, no, we're going to shut off this investigation. This is a big deal. This is like a constitutional issue that we haven't faced in a long time. And so we're seeing states pass legislation like this. Washington, Colorado, Hawaii, they all explicitly protect trans healthcare access, mandate health insurance coverage for all trans procedures. These are, so I'm going to try to go quickly because I know that I want to leave time for questions. These are my 5 rankings, like the states in terms of anti-trans legislation, the worst and the best in terms of the laws that protect or the laws that target. Tennessee has that drag ban I was talking about earlier, the gender affirming care ban. Depending on the bills that Tennessee passes, Tennessee might move up in the rankings. Florida's pretty bad too, though, because Florida has the social transition memo that might be leading to social transition bans. Gender affirming care bans are in Florida right now. In Arkansas, we've got detransition bills, possible adult bathroom bans moving in right now. The first adult bathroom ban might be moving. In Alabama, we see a felony detransition bill, bathroom bans for trans youth. And in Texas, we have that enforcement effort around child abuse, which if the courts ever allow that to come back into place, Texas is going to be by far the worst. In terms of best states for protective rights, Massachusetts covers most surgeries. They've got Medicaid coverage. They've got one of those safe state laws. Washington, D.C., where 1 in 30 people are transgender. This is my city, Washington, D.C. I love the Washington, D.C. region. 1 in 30 people are trans here. In Washington State, comprehensive healthcare coverage exists so trans people can get the healthcare coverage they need. In Hawaii, there is a safe state law passed. There's strong protections. There's a healthcare law there. And in Colorado, there's comprehensive healthcare coverage, as well as strong social protections. There's a trans legislator at the state level. Lots of protections in Colorado. So future laws to watch out for. These, I keep my eyes out. I know all the things that are coming down the wire. There are out-of-state travel bans that might come into place that say it's illegal to travel out of state for abortion or for transition. We saw this in Missouri and in Idaho last year. I think we're going to see it again. More extreme don't say gay bills. We already talked about how Florida's is getting more extreme. We're seeing this in other places like Louisiana. Social transition bans, I mentioned that before. So bans on cutting your hair using, different clothing and a new name and pronouns. Renewed adult bathroom bans. We're seeing that in Arkansas right now. Adult transition bans. There are bills that we've seen that would push the age up to 25 before you're allowed to start gender affirming care. Criminal don't say gay and trans laws that target librarians, for instance. We've seen some bills that would jail librarians for obscene material. Repeals of marriage equality. Roe V. Wade puts Obergefell at risk. And even though we have the Respect for Marriage Act, that has not been tested constitutionally. So we might start to see some issues there. Repeals of anti-sodomy laws and anti-drag laws. Now, the last one, fighting back. Sort of how to be an effective advocate. First, I'm going to tell you all the organizations that are involved in passing these laws. We have the American Principles Project, the Alliance Defending Freedom, WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front, which actually is a sort of turf, they build themselves as a feminist organization. They work with the American Principles Project, Alliance Defending Freedom, which explicitly, for instance, outlaw abortion, etc. So there's some interesting cross-pollination there. SEGM, Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, which likes to portray itself as an evidence-based doctors group, but it's really a tiny splinter group of people that go against gender-affirming care, similar to how you have those tiny anti-mask doctor groups that, parade ivermectin or something. And the American College of Pediatricians, they like to go to all of the hearings and talk about how they are the American College of Pediatricians. It's meant to confuse legislators with the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so they explicitly have their name that way to confuse people. Biden administration is doing a few things. DOJ intervention in Alabama was successful. So right now the Alabama law is blocked in court, and this is in part because the Biden administration joined in on that fight. We've had some strongly worded letters and memos. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that much more from the federal government in taking any action against these states. We have seen pushbacks in states under attack. This is a big slide, but basically just summed up really quickly. What's worked is like highlighting that all of the opposition seems to always fly in from state to state. Meanwhile, the people that are against these bills are in the state. Reaching out to legislators in social media has worked. In some cases, professional activism, using your medical opinions, using your professional skills that you're developing and that you have is so important. And then in court, we've seen things like substantive due process and medical rights under the Affordable Care Act. And in states not under attack, so I'm talking to all of you, and maybe you haven't seen anti-trans bills proposed in your state. That doesn't mean, though, that there's nothing you can do. No state is perfect on LGBTQ rights. You can always lobby for full healthcare protections, like in Hawaii, Oregon, and Colorado. New York does not have such protections. You can lobby for LGBTQ non-discrimination laws in schools. Remember I told you how there's that inclusive curricula law. New York doesn't have that. There are some schools that have don't say gay bills locally. Sports equality laws, comprehensive sex education is always good. Protections for LGBTQ prisoners broadly. Shelters, easier name and gender changes, which are so huge for people. Unamended birth certificate changes, so marking your birth certificate without an amended designation. Safe state laws. New York does not have a safe state law, but it would be great if New York had a law where people can come to New York if they're fleeing persecution from other states. And then for you, some next steps you can do if you ever want to look up some of these laws, legiscan.com is a great place to look them up. You can also, if you want to track them, I try to make it easier for everybody, so you can look me up at Erin in the Morning. Just Google Erin in the Morning, you'll get to my Substack. Change your media diet. I think that this is important, even if it's not me. Follow trans content creators, celebrities, and activists. Keep a rich diet of people who you are hearing from, so that way you start to include some of these marginalized communities in your info stream. Watch Disclosure. It's a really good documentary. It goes over all of this. It goes over the history of how trans people have been represented. Get to know your state representative. A lot of times you can reach out to your state representative and talk to them directly. They only represent a small number of people. A lot of times the phone number on their website goes to their cell phone. You can talk to your state representative. Talk to them about, ask them some of these questions. What are you doing? How are you dealing with these issues in my state? Follow them on social media. If you email them, they're more likely to answer. Stay active in your professional societies and organizations. I have seen that statements from medical, legal, student groups. I just watched a really compelling student group statement in Montana. These are essential. Speak up for queer and trans people in your lives. If you see them being discriminated against, let people know that's not okay. And urge your legislators to pass positive laws. And that is the end of my presentation. I know that we are going to move towards a more formal Q&A part, so I'm going to exit out of here, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk to all of you about this.
That was brilliant. Thank you. Should I maybe sort of step in, or are there already questions that were circulating?
I would love for you to step in. I can look at the live stream too.
Well,
as well as any of us here.
Yeah, and I'm open to questions. Anybody I can talk about. I probably have an encyclopedic knowledge of all these laws and states. So if you have any questions about your home state or your friends or any of this, I can talk about it.
I just want to also say that during Black History Month, one of the things I was trying to celebrate people as often as I could on our Instagram, and one person that I thought was so interesting, Lucy Hicks Anderson, who was born in 1886, was trans, and her parents took her to the doctors when she was a teenager in the 1920s, and her doctors, I guess they saw several doctors, they said, oh, absolutely, she needs to live her life as a woman. She's a woman, and this is what's going to be healthiest for her. And so she did. And yeah.
Lucy Anderson is amazing. Lucy Anderson was a child transitioner. And this goes to show, trans people have always been here. Trans kids have always been here. They say it's a trend, but trans people have always been here. Her story is fascinating. She was such an amazing cook, okay? So, she was an amazing cook. and she cooked for her entire town. There was one time where she was discovered, and they were going to arrest her, and the local banker came into the police office place and said, "No, I'm bailing her out. I have a dinner that she has to cook for a bunch of bankers tonight." And she went and cooked an amazing dinner for a bunch of bankers, and she had support of her community for so long.
That's amazing. So I love that story and love knowing about her because it really highlights how much of a backlash we're living in right now. This is not the way it's always been, you know.
Exactly.
Does anyone in front of me here in the room? I would show the room, but I realized I'm not sure.
I got to see the room earlier, so that was nice.
So that's good. Anyone here in the room have a question? And if I can relay it, if Erin and B can't hear it, you can also look on the live stream, and B, if you want to ask questions, comments, or add to the conversation.
So, well, I have a list, but I think the favorite on my list is in particular the way that you had mentioned changing your media diet and what kind of media you're bringing in. I've noticed that, and as I was speaking to Kelly before the talk, it can be incredibly daunting and spiritually, emotionally, bodily draining to see the kinds of politics that's spreading and entrenching, and in that sense, we're re-entrenching. And in that shift towards media that's content and has content directly coming from trans activists and scholars and writers, and I wonder, is that, it sounds like a silly question, but it sounds like that's the one necessary step towards keeping the energy levels that I see you have, because it is so easy to become despondent and feel as though at best we have cruel optimism about the politics of change, and at worst we just choose not to do anything.
Yeah. So I'm glad that you said that, and I think that this is, not only is this a good practice, but it's fun in a lot of ways. Like, if you expose yourself to queer joy and you see trans people experiencing joy and creating something that you enjoy, that in and of itself can help get through mental barriers that we all have. And let me be clear, we all have those barriers. We all have to deal with transphobia, even trans people. Like, as a trans person myself, I had to deal with internalized transphobia, and I'm trans. Like, I know how difficult getting over those things can be for people. And one of the things that helps is inclusion with your media diet. It's seeing and exposure, mere exposure. I make content on TikTok. I have a large number of TikTok creators that I follow that are trans, and it's not that like they talk about being trans all the time. In fact, a lot of them don't. But it's that they produce amazing content, like in its own right, just really fun stuff. There are actors and actresses and people that are in all of these movies and TV shows that are trans. I watched Amy Schneider on Jeopardy, not just because she was trans, but because she was brilliant. And I watched every day while she was doing her run. So yeah, it is important to maintaining that like energy level, that joy, because it's important that you hold on to that. This is not just like this legal fight or this legislative thing that's going on. And yes, include those people in your diet as well. I'm one of them. I write about legislative issues. But it's also like, it's about your right to exist, to have fun, to enjoy life, to have a full life. Go see a drag show. Like go to all kinds of drag shows. Go to a drag brunch. Drag brunches are wonderful. They're so much fun. Have a mimosa, go to a drag brunch. Like, do things like that. Keep these people in your life, and that's the best disinfectant.
Yeah, no, I was so taken by that, and especially in that way, it brings up a connection that was being made. It was implicit in everything that you were saying, in the connections between trans social justice and medical equity and access and reproductive justice frameworks, where there is this holism there, narratives of life, making a life, being, connects up with not only just sort of larger states' rights discourses, but actually just living, making that not even a minimum progression from day to day, but finding those joys, it seems to me, is directly connected to reproductive justice frameworks. And I don't know, it was just it was just quite brilliant. It was a brilliant set of connections that you were making.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. And I agree. I think that those connections have to be made. I think that together we are, by looking at the way that our experiences with oppression in general intersect with one another, we can learn from one another. Also, you're getting to see my cat Cupcake, so she loves to join all of my. Hi.
Hi, Cupcake.
Not the first time, won't be the last. I can be in the most important meetings in my life. She'll come and join.
You just haven't been hearing my cats meowing this entire time outside the door because I'm wondering why I have the audacity to keep the door closed.
Uh-huh.
I'm looking also at the audience to see anyone getting the courage after that.
I can answer anything. It doesn't have to be about laws, y'all. And yes, I use y'all. I'm from Louisiana, so you might hear me say y'all.
I'm from North Carolina.
Nice, nice.
So something that was brought up, I saw on the map that North Carolina had a less stringent amendation.
Mm-hmm.
And into an obstacle. Was it about simply change? Well, it's never simply or merely changing one's name or sex markers. My petition was immediately met with, it requires a written consent from a medical practitioner with the intent or have already undergone surgical transition related intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like gobsmacked because I thought that there had been a court ruling suspending that particular requirement.
Yeah.
Did that just suddenly go away, or now is it back?
So North Carolina, you should, I believe, not need that requirement. However, one thing that I have noticed many times whenever these changes are made at the state level is that sometimes those changes don't percolate down to the people that are actually doing it. You know, I'll tell you it.
Yes.
The Social Security office, the Biden administration changed like the requirements for getting your gender updated at the Social Security office, and like a month or two later, this is a federal government thing. A month or two later, like there were still many reports of trans people being told that they had the old policy in effect. And so like this is just like another thing, y'all. Laws are one thing, like changing the laws are one thing, but then it's also a matter of like how these laws are enforced. And so this is such an important point to bring up because it goes way beyond just birth certificates and like gender marker changes. Tennessee drag ban, you know, sure, there are things in that law that state that you have to appeal to a prurient interest, you know, and that prevents being enforced upon you. But like we know how cops are gonna see prurient. We know how people are gonna treat this law. And so enforcement is always unequal. And this is not just true for the trans community, but true for all minorities that experience any sort of systemic injustice.
And
I think we have somebody.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Rose, I'm actually the one who's camera on right now for this. You've talked a lot, yeah. I just want to ask, so you've talked a lot about the laws for anti-discrimination, the laws that discriminate, but if you're in a state that does have anti-discrimination laws and you are being discriminated against, what do you do? You know, I personally face this. I'll go to a doctor and they'll just, like, I had one doctor turn me away, refuse to see me for care, and all I could do, like,
Yeah, and by the way, I'm sorry that you had that experience. I know many people that are trans and were in the military or are in the military right now. And I will say that things have not improved there as much as people think that they have. Biden administration came in and overturned the Trump era policy of banning trans people, and yet I know people that are trans in the military that continually have to fight with their superiors in order to have their gender markers changed. I know many. I know a transgender woman who was forced to present male for 18 months after coming out to her sergeant, was forced to go for the after hours events presenting male, wearing polo shirts and shorts, and couldn't grow her hair out. And so there is, even though these policies change, the enforcement isn't always there. And so your question about what do you do whenever, even if you live in a protective state where you get discriminated against, and this is going to be different for each state. I know that some states, for instance, Montana has something called the Human Rights Commission, which is a state-run organization where if you appeal to them, they will launch an investigation for you. Now, sometimes even that can be unequal, but in a state like New York, I would look for that. I would look to check if there is a New York Human Rights Commission. A lot of states do have them. I would say, especially in protective states, that can help you navigate that. Likewise, don't only look at your state. Your city, likewise, might also have similar services. These services often are not made super knowledgeable to the general public, unfortunately, and so even accessing them is sort of a way in which inequalities can get perpetuated, because you're talking to me right here, and I can tell you, look up the New York Human Rights Commission, or look up the New York City Human Rights Commission, and look up them wherever. There's going to be some of these that can help you navigate those discrimination claims. But there's a lot of people that might not even have access to computers, or that might have difficulty in even finding time to talk to these people. And I think this is why socially we have to also advocate in our day-to-day lives. Likewise, if that doesn't work out for you, if you don't find a human rights commission that can stand in for you, look at the specific kind of discrimination that you're experiencing. So if it's workplace discrimination, you will most likely have an EEOC in your state that you can appeal to. And if it's a protective state, they probably have explicit protections against around this stuff. If it's a healthcare discrimination claim, you can talk to your insurance commission. And this is something that a lot of trans people have a great difficulty navigating. So,
Yeah.
local LGBT orgs too. Check out those. Those are always.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't know what happens if this anti-discrimination law can discriminate. Is that a court case? Is that something? Is that a court
So a lot of
case?
times.
How does that
No. A lot of times it will never involve going to court. A lot of times it's actually just commission based. So the commission will arbitrate and will make a judgment. And then if the workplace or the healthcare, the hospital pushes back, then it can rise to that level of going to court. And in most of those cases, the commission will assign a representative to you.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
No problem.
I have another question. Thank you so much for that question, Rose. I feel like that's another thing that to help people in the community to be that linkage. And luckily in CUNY, we have an LGBTQIA+ consortium and also council. So we kind of communicate across all the CUNY schools, and there are resources that many people are aware of. So being a CUNY student, once you go and find your LGBTQ center, that's a great first step. And also just the city's gay center is a great resource.
So I just looked it up, and you can see right here real quick. New York has a Human Rights Commission page. So if you go to nyc.gov or just look up New York Human Rights Commission, you can click here to report discrimination. They'll schedule an appointment with you. And that, by the way, was an excellent thing that you just mentioned about student groups. I see a lot of colleges also have navigators for this kind of stuff.
Sammy, do you have a question?
Oh,
Might have been a while. Yeah, it's probably easier. I think you have another question.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
So, with Women's History Month coming up, what are things that you might encourage people to do to make sure that they're being inclusive in any events stance they're holding, or even just in like the language they're using, talking about women's history month?
I think like that's a really good question, and I think that intersectionality is so important. So look at the kinds of women who you're including in your discussions around women and around women's history and like what women's history is. Include Black women, include queer women, include trans women for sure, include women with disabilities. Like all of these things. We tend to think of like these groups of people that have faced systematic injustice, women, as well as all these other groups as being discrete, and yet like we all operate under all of these axes of discrimination. And so just make sure that you are very intentional about which women you are talking about. Just make sure that it doesn't just turn into like Women's History Month is a history of cis white, heterosexual women. And I think that that's like one important thing.
And don't let the conversations sort of conjure a haunting image of every woman or woman of color or trans person being abject or without, in that sense, without access to the affective means towards joy, community, and happiness. So it's really easy sometimes, especially in like critical theory classes, some of which I teach, to fall into that kind of queer negativity, where suddenly that's what makes the community. And sort of circling back to realizing, to bring up, as you mentioned, Tyra Hunter, is then to also level that out with advocacy work and activism around what happened precisely then, and what has changed and what's not changed, but most certainly to bring into circulation something this is my attempt not to become the pessimist, but that it focuses on just precisely how political activism does create infrastructural change, if not structural change, infrastructural change.
Absolutely.
If people do need to leave, I know that some people have classes. Please do sign in if you didn't sign in at the table over here. That's really important. But we still have people, and we still might have questions. Rose is back maybe with a question. I also have a question. Maybe Rose is just... I also wanted to mention there are two board members from the club here, and so I want to quickly say Rose, who you heard earlier, is the president, and Erin, also the treasurer, is here.
Over here.
Right here. Hi, Erin. I have one quick question too. I know that the New York Times coverage on gender affirming rights for trans youth especially has been so horrendous because it tends to frame it around an issue of like, because there are people who detransition, which is completely something that does happen. But I'm hearing this language. I'm not even going to say who or how or where to not call anyone out, but I need help in how to talk about that specific issue because I'm appalled sometimes by what I'm hearing from adults around me around this issue in New York City.
Absolutely. I was one of the signatories to the New York Times letter. I was asked by GLAAD to sign it. And the reason why we wrote that letter is because of inaccurate coverage of transgender people. So everything from you mentioned, detransitioners, which detransitioners are being platformed. I, as a trans woman, have many detransitioner friends, people that have detransitioned, because I'm an activist and I seek out, these voices and I try to ensure that I'm speaking to them. And most of them do not detransition because they're not trans. Most of the detrans people that I know are people who detransition because their parents didn't accept them, or because they were about to get fired from their job, or because they're experiencing extreme discrimination in a rural area of a red state. Literally all of the detrans people that I know fall into those categories. And so research bears this out. If you look it up, the most common reason for detransition is lack of acceptance, and most detransitioners will eventually retransition. So this is all part of gender affirming care. The New York Times tends to frame detransition as the latter, as people detransition because they're not trans, or because they made a terrible medical mistake, because that's what makes the headlines. Like that's that's what is fiery and impactful, even though that's not how like it works in reality. And then also, they get a lot of science facts wrong. Medical organizations have had to correct them many times, release like multiple page memos correcting them. They never let transgender people write about transgender people. The people that are often writing these front page high impact stories are cisgender people that often also have ties to um, people that are morally opposed to our care. And then all of their articles get cited in the court battles and in the legislatures. And so I joined several writers, several activists, and tell the New York Times to do better. And I think that the letter itself is really good in how it like explains the problems with the coverage. And it also touches on the same issue that I did around transgender people and detransitioners.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and they just kind of, their response to that letter was just like, they kind of just brushed it off. Erin, do you have a question? Or just, I just see you here. Anyone have a question? If you do.
Well, I was gonna say that not everybody like detransitions. I mean, like more than 98% of people who are trans actually declare it, and they are proud of it.
This is true. This is true.
So yeah, statistics, quoting statistics is a helpful thing to do.
Yeah, 98% will maintain their transition up to 5 or 6 years later. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff like this, and I think that like the data's out there. People are aware, and unfortunately, in legislatures, it still hasn't swayed some of them from passing all these laws. Kind of sucks sometimes, but we're fighting, and that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here to like spread awareness of this info.
Rose, do you guys want to say something? I think maybe the club wants to say hi before we end it.
Sure. Of course.
I don't want to take up the space of our presenters. I just wanted to say hi before everyone has to class. People have to leave. I'm Rose. I'm the president of LGBTQ Club. Erin is our treasurer.
Yeah, I'm the treasurer of the LGBTQ Plus Alliance Club.
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Anyone needs anything, feel free to reach out to us. You can get our contact info if you want to ask questions from Kelly or Sammy. And Sammy and Kelly are both great resources if you have any questions. Their office and our club room is over in the student activities building, second floor. I don't know the room number.
It's our 219 student center.
Yeah, so that would be the room to go to. We have a nice little room with water, we have a coffee maker, we have computers you can use, and couches and stuff to hang out in. So if anyone doesn't know that, I'd like to just put that out there so everyone's aware. Anything else, Erin?
Well, another thing is that like if you go to the resource center, 219 student center, it's gonna feel like home.
Thanks, Erin.
Nice.
That's all.
Thanks so much for saying that. You'll meet friends. Yeah, please do come. You'll meet these wonderful people and other people as well. I don't see any questions on the live stream. I'm looking at it. So,
I will ask you
one more question
Yeah,
for us.
I'm gonna come back.
Sure.
My question is, do you mind if people reach out to you, or do you have contact info for like if they have follow-up questions or they want to know things? Do you have
Absolutely. I've got several platforms that you can reach out to me on. If you ever do have a question or you need to reach out to me, message me on Instagram, message me on Twitter. My DMs are always open on both. You can go to my Substack, and I have contact info there as well. So if you Google Erin in the morning, you'll go to the About page, and you'll see ways to contact me there. There are lots of ways you can reach out to me. I will say that like I have a lot of people that do reach out to me, so if it is something that's like a big deal, I'm gonna scan it and I'm gonna jump into it if it seems like it's gonna be something that I can make a difference in. But please do reach out to me if like there's something big that you need to report or like you need to talk to me. I'm here.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I ask because some people might not feel comfortable asking a question out loud, and if anyone has any questions,
Of course.
what they can do to address those.
Of course. Thank you so much. You've been great.
Well, you've been totally amazing and inspiring, and again mentioned this that we were talking to each other earlier, and and just talking about how inspired we are by your energy and your continued passion. And I love how you're framing it as it's fun. And it really is true. I feel like activism is really fun. It's where you meet people and you actually feel like you're just doing something. And I can just feel that in all of your social media presence, that your passion is pushing you forward. And it's just wonderful. So I feel so fortunate that we've been able to have you here today. So thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, B, for being such an amazing host as well and moderator as well. It's been great.
You made this particular role incredibly easy. You're awesome. Thank you so much for speaking to us. This was great, absolutely great.
Of course.
All right, you guys. Well, with that, I'm gonna go ahead and sign off.
Good luck with the snow, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.